Hi, this is Gordon Patterson. I thought I'd take a few minutes and talk to you about what's coming up on the exam. Begin by looking at the review materials that I gave you. You'll find now on Angel, under the Course Materials button, a folder called Study Guides. And in that folder, I placed a copy of both the questions that deal with the first 5 weeks of the course and terms from the Fonner book, and the 10 essay questions, which you're going to find a selection of on the examination. Reviewing those terms, working through the questions, those things are good things that will help you strengthen your performance on the exam. Let's take 5 minutes now and just walk through what we've done this semester. We started out talking about Reconstruction, the meaning of what this event signaled in American life. Remember, the underlying motif of this course is how the idea of freedom has changed, evolved in our 160 years since the war between the states. Reconstruction brought freedom, a new sense of freedom, to 4 million African Americans, the free men and the free women. And we talked about how there were different conceptions of what Reconstruction would be. The presidential Reconstruction of Andrew Johnson, the radical Reconstruction of Thaddeus Stevens, and the radical Republicans. We talked about the importance of the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. You should know what those amendments do, particularly the 14th Amendment, because it changes the locus, the place of where the responsibility for protecting Americans' freedom shifts from the states to the federal government under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The 15th Amendment stirred a debate about who could vote, African Americans, and it also separated off women, suffragettes, who had argued that not extending the vote to women was in fact an injury to the Republic. We discussed things such as the Tenure of Office Act that led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, how a campaign slogan like waving the bloody shirt affected the presidential campaigns. We talked about the problem of carpetbaggers and scallywags, or at least what was perceived to be that way, the Redeemers who sought to bring back control of the government to the Southern Democrats. In Chapter 16, we discussed the Gilded Age, and there I'd emphasize this new kind of confluence of matters, rapid urbanization, population growth, the new industrialization that was taking place, how this created new circumstances in American life that raised questions about what freedom meant, the concept of liberty of contract, the right of an individual to make whatever kind of contract they want, and the inability of the government to interfere with that contract. The cases that the Supreme Court dealt with that issue, we alluded to in class. We talked about, in some respects, the change in business organization with pools, trusts, and monopolies, about early labor unrest. We talked about social Darwinism, this attitude of moving the Darwinian theory to the social world. The 17th chapter dealt with populism, the agrarian movement, farmers movement, and we emphasized this new event in American history, the American empire in this age of imperialism. Remember the Turner thesis, the idea of the frontier and manifest destiny, and how this developed in the turn of the 20th century into a mission abroad. I'd call your attention, in terms of Supreme Court cases, the civil rights cases of the 1880s, which significantly curtailed the rights of African Americans. And Lochner, the Lochner case of 1905, that said that the government couldn't interfere to limit the number of hours that bakers in New York City could work. We talked about the conflict that was present in terms of Americans' idea of owning and having an empire, and how the color line and the race question entered into that. In Chapter 18, we discussed progressivism. And progressivism, I stressed, it was a kind of contradictory thing. In one sense, it expanded freedom, and in another sense, it contracted it. You need to be able to talk about the ways in which the progressives were in themselves a complex group of people, and how progressivism affected the ways in which we imagine government acting, how it affected consumerism, the question of women's control of their bodies, Margaret Sanger, the development of feminism in this period. And finally, we ended this part of the course talking about World War I and the presidential progressives of Roosevelt and the Roosevelt Corollary, and Taft, dollar diplomacy, and Wilson and moral imperialism, and then the outbreak of World War I. And I emphasized in this week's discussions that World War I had profound influences in American life. It strengthened mightily the role of the federal government in terms of how it was able to, in war production and coal and oil production and farm production, exercise an influence that hitherto had not been present in American life. And we ended the discussion talking about the Committee on Public Information, the role of the state in informing or creating propaganda, and how that led to a notion of Americanism and led to a Red Scare after World War I. The questions that I gave you to look at, these 10 questions, offer you a way in which you can go through, and I've got my copy of them here, and I hope you have your copy of them as well, of how reconstructions did witness profound changes. There are contradictions in it. Was it a success or a failure? How did the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution, change American life? What role did the word freedom have for Native Americans? What groups were denied freedom in this period of economic development? What about the war in the Philippines? How did it change things? With that question, in fact, I ask you to make reference to a couple of the documents that are in the Foner book. You'll find them on pages, I have the book in front of me, 666 and 667. Here, an audio-visual guide for you. Here are the 2 pages on the Philippines. You should be able to find this and study that. McKinley and Aguinaldo talking about what freedom meant to them. I ask you about the Progressive Era, and I ask you finally to talk about women. All of these things you can study. My goal in this class is for you to reflect upon American history, to think about the events that shaped us in this first 50 years that we've discussed. Spend some time, review Foner, look at the study guide. You can do well in this course. You can do well if you study and if you think, and you will do well. I look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Thanks for taking time to study. Thanks for taking time for being my students. I'll see you on Thursday.